You can sign a power purchase agreement, lock in a competitive electricity price, even pay monthly for capacity, and still be unable to run a green hydrogen plant. This is one of the most unintuitive failures in the entire energy transition, and it's happening quietly across North America and Europe. On paper, these projects look sound. Cheap renewable power, electrolyzers installed, offtake discussions underway. But in reality, many of these facilities sit idle or underutilized, not because electricity is unavailable, but because access to electricity is not the same thing as permission to use it. The grid does not behave the way hydrogen developers expect it to behave, and that mismatch is breaking economics long before anyone reaches final investment decision. Most energy discussions start with price. What is the cost per megawatt hour? How low can solar or wind go? How aggressive is the PPA? But hydrogen is not a consumption technology, it is a conversion technology. It turns electrons into molecules, and the grid was not designed for that purpose. It was designed to move electricity from generators to consumers under strict reliability constraints. When you introduce large electrolyzers, you are not simply adding another load. You are introducing a system that wants to run continuously, predictably, and at scale. The grid is optimized for none of those things simultaneously. This is where the first illusion appears. Developers assume that if they can buy power, they can use power. That assumption is wrong. Electricity markets separate financial rights from physical delivery. You can pay for electricity and still be curtailed. You can contract power and still be denied dispatch. You can interconnect and still be told to stand down. None of this is obvious in the early modeling stages, and almost all spreadsheet-based hydrogen models ignore it entirely. Interconnection is often mistaken for access. It is not. Interconnection simply means the grid operator has studied your project and determined that under certain conditions you can physically connect to the grid without violating reliability standards. It does not guarantee that electricity will flow when you want it to. It does not guarantee that congestion will not block you. It does not guarantee that other generators or loads will not be prioritized ahead of you. Interconnection is permission to plug in, not permission to operate. Curtailment is the next surprise. Renewable developers are familiar with curtailment, but hydrogen developers underestimate its impact because electrolyzers are capital-intensive machines that require high utilization to make economic sense. A wind farm can tolerate curtailment because its marginal cost is low. An electrolyzer cannot. Every hour it does not run, fixed costs still accrue. Stack degradation does not pause. Financing assumptions unravel. A 70% utilization model collapses if real-world dispatch drops to 40 or 50%. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between survival and failure. The grid does not curtail evenly. It curtails locally. Congestion occurs at nodes, substations, and transmission bottlenecks. Two projects a few miles apart can have radically different outcomes. One may run freely, the other may face frequent restrictions. Hydrogen developers often pick sites based on renewable proximity or land availability, only to discover later that the grid node they chose is saturated. At that point, the electricity exists, but the pathway to deliver it does not. Even firm contracts do not save you. Many power purchase agreements provide financial hedging, not physical priority. You are paying for energy, not guaranteed delivery. In markets like those operated by ERCOT or PJM, grid operators dispatch resources based on reliability and congestion management, not contractual arrangements between private parties. When constraints tighten, electrolyzers are often among the first loads to be reduced because they are flexible and non-essential from a grid stability perspective. This introduces a brutal asymmetry. Hydrogen needs the grid to operate. The grid does not need hydrogen. When the system is stressed, hydrogen loses. That is the system reality most project decks avoid stating explicitly. The problem compounds when multiple hydrogen projects cluster in the same region. Early movers assume they are alone. Later arrivals stack onto the same substations, transmission corridors, and renewable zones. Suddenly, everyone is competing for limited capacity. The grid queue lengthens. Upgrade costs rise. Timelines stretch. Projects that once modeled 2 years to operation now face 5 or 7. Meanwhile, electrolyzer technology advances, incentives change, and offtake commitments weaken. Time becomes an invisible cost driver that models rarely include. This is why paying for power is not enough. Access is conditional, situational, and revocable. It depends on weather patterns, load growth, transmission outages, and regulatory decisions. Hydrogen plants want steady-state operation. Grids operate in dynamic equilibrium. Those two philosophies clash. The irony is that green hydrogen is often promoted as a grid balancing solution. Flexible load, excess renewable absorption, demand response. All of that is theoretically true, but flexibility cuts both ways. When you design a project around being flexible, you're also designing it to be interrupted. Flexibility becomes a justification for curtailment, not protection against it. The very feature that makes hydrogen attractive to planners undermines its economics for investors. This tension becomes more severe as penetration increases. A single electrolyzer can absorb excess power occasionally. 10 electrolyzers cannot all absorb the same surplus simultaneously. At scale, hydrogen stops being a balancing tool and starts being a base load. The grid treats base loads differently. Once hydrogen crosses that threshold, it inherits the same constraints as industrial consumers, without the same historical priority. Geography determines winners and losers. Isolated grids, islands, and weakly interconnected systems often provide better conditions for hydrogen because congestion is visible and planning is centralized. Overbuilt renewable zones with dedicated transmission fare better. Industrial clusters with legacy infrastructure fare worse. Ironically, the places with the highest energy demand and decarbonization pressure are often the hardest places to run electrolyzers reliably. The timeline matters just as much as location. In the 2030 horizon, many hydrogen projects will fail not because technology did not work, but because grid upgrades did not arrive on time. Transmission expansion moves slowly. Permitting is contentious. Public opposition grows. A hydrogen project that depends on future grid relief is betting on political alignment, regulatory efficiency, and community acceptance all at once. That is not a technical risk. That is a governance risk. By 2050, the picture bifurcates. Either grids are massively reinforced and hydrogen integrates cleanly, or hydrogen retreats into niches where it can operate autonomously. Co-located renewable-to-hydrogen systems, behind-the-meter installations, dedicated generation, and isolated microgrids become the dominant survivors. Grid-dependent hydrogen becomes the exception, not the rule. This is why cost targets alone are misleading. Developers obsess over achieving $2 per kilogram while ignoring whether they can physically operate enough hours to realize that cost. A low-cost electron that cannot be used is infinitely expensive. Utilization matters more than headline price. A project running fewer hours at a higher electricity price can outperform a cheap power project that sits idle. Financial models rarely simulate dispatch risk. They assume average annual prices, average capacity factors, and smooth operation. Reality is spiky. Peaks and troughs dominate. Congestion events cluster. Curtailment is not evenly distributed. One bad month can erase a year of margin. Debt does not care why a plant did not run. Covenants trigger regardless of excuses. This is where system stress exposes weak assumptions. What happens during a heat wave when air conditioning load spikes? What happens during a cold snap when heating demand surges? What happens when a major transmission line goes down? In all of those scenarios, electrolyzers are dispensable. They are the first to be asked to step aside. That is not a failure of policy. It is a rational grid response. Some developers attempt to solve this with batteries. Batteries help, but only partially. They smooth short-term variability, not multi-day or seasonal constraints. They add cost. They introduce their own degradation curves. They do not create transmission capacity where none exists. Batteries can buffer, not bypass, grid limits. Others pursue direct renewable coupling. This avoids some grid issues but introduces new ones. Renewable output is variable. Overbuilding generation raises capex. Storage requirements grow. Land use expands. Permitting complexity increases. Direct coupling trades grid risk for resource risk. It is not a free solution. The uncomfortable truth is that green hydrogen is not blocked by physics. It is blocked by systems. Institutional inertia, infrastructure bottlenecks, and planning mismatches do more damage than efficiency losses or catalyst limitations. Engineers can design electrolyzers that work. Economists can model projects that pencil. But if the system context is wrong, none of it matters. This is why so many projects stall before final investment decision. Not because the idea was flawed, but because reality intruded late. Grid studies revised assumptions. Upgrade costs doubled. Timelines slipped. Investors lost patience. Of course, these failures are rarely announced publicly. They fade quietly. Announcements stop. Websites go dormant. Press releases never arrive. If you want to understand which hydrogen projects will survive, stop asking who has the cheapest power. Ask who controls their operating conditions, who can run independently, who can tolerate interruption, who has structured offtake that matches variability, who understands that electrons and molecules live in different system worlds. This is also where policy narratives break down. Subsidies can lower costs, but they cannot accelerate transmission overnight. Incentives can encourage electrolyzer deployment, but they cannot override grid physics. Hydrogen strategies that ignore infrastructure sequencing are setting projects up to fail politely. The path forward is not pessimism, it is realism. Hydrogen must be planned as infrastructure, not as an add-on. It must align with grid expansion, not assume it. It must respect dispatch rules, not wish them away. Developers who internalize this early design differently, they choose sites based on access, not price. They model worst-case utilization, not best-case averages. They negotiate offtake that tolerates variability. They survive. This is where an ecosystem-level view becomes essential. Developers, investors, utilities, and regulators must speak the same language. Hydrogen cannot be treated as just another renewable consumer. It is a system amplifier. It magnifies weaknesses and exposes bottlenecks. Used wisely, it can stabilize. Used naively, it destabilizes projects financially. At this point in the discussion, ReneEnergy points viewers to H2 Hub as a resource for examining hydrogen projects through system constraints rather than presentation-level assumptions. Topics like grid access, operating hours, financing structure, and execution risk are treated as core inputs, not secondary considerations. For anyone involved in developing, assessing, or financing hydrogen projects, this type of analysis helps clarify what actually determines viability. And this is also where practical tools matter. Financial models, project finance templates, and planning frameworks do not replace judgment, but they force assumptions into the open. They reveal where utilization breaks economics. They show how small dispatch changes cascade into large financial consequences. Used properly, they are diagnostic instruments, not promotional material. The takeaway is simple, even if the implications are not. Paying for power does not guarantee you can use it. The grid is not a neutral conduit. It is an active system with priorities, constraints, and failure modes. Green hydrogen lives or dies inside that system. Ignore it, and projects fail quietly. Respect it, and hydrogen becomes viable where it actually fits. The next video continues this arc by examining what happens when electricity exists. Renewables are abundant, and hydrogen still cannot access them. Because availability and accessibility are not the same thing, and confusing them has already cost the industry years.